Okay, we're gonna go ahead and get started. All right. Welcome everyone to the fourth and final panel. We are gonna be talking about big ideas in human rights. My name is Jessica Denhouder. I am the clinical teaching fellow with the Family Law Clinic here at the University of Baltimore. And we are delighted to have just a wonderful panel with us this afternoon. So I will, first we will hear from, and I'll introduce first, Assis Basine. Ms. Basine is the Senior Research Fellow at the Solomon Center for Health Law and Policy at Yale Law School. Prior to joining the center, Assis worked as the Georgetown Women's Law and Public Policy Fellow at the National Partnership for Women and Families in Washington, D.C., where she worked on reproductive health and justice issues, as well as maternal and infant health policy. Her scholarship is forthcoming in the Georgetown Immigration Law Journal. After we hear from Ms. Basine, we will hear from Professor Elizabeth Keys. Professor Keys directs the Immigrant Rights Clinic at the University of Baltimore School of Law, where she also teaches immigration law and professional responsibility. She has been practicing immigration law and especially asylum law for almost 20 years. Her scholarship explores gaps and inequities in refugee protection regimes, especially the gaps facing migrants displaced by climate change. And we will be joined shortly by our final panelist on this panel, Professor Marcy Caron, and she is the Jack and Lovell Olander Professor of Law and Director of the Legislation Civil Rights Clinic at UDC David A. Clark School of Law. Her recent scholarship focuses on menstrual justice at work, during the bar exam, and in immigration detention, workplace protections for menstruators, breastfeeding workers, domestic violence survivors, the military community, and people with disabilities. Professor Caron is the 2023 Fulbright Scotland Distinguished Scholar at the University of Edinburgh, where she will study the impact of Scotland's Period Products Act on menstrual justice at work and at school. We're delighted to have them with us this afternoon, and I'll start with Ms. Basine.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to the Center for Applied Feminism, Margaret, Michelle, and all the students for putting together this lovely conference. I want to share that this is my first presentation at a conference ever. So if I say something, so I would be grateful for your grace if I say something to meet it. I also want to say that it's an honor to be presenting alongside these incredible scholars. Today, I'm going to be presenting my paper, Love in the Time of ICE, How Parents Without Papers Are Stripped of the Right to Raise Their Children in Safe and Healthy Environments. So I decided to write this paper after I volunteered at the Dilley Family Detention Center in South Texas. And one of our clients, who was an asylum seeker, broke down sobbing because her young toddler was running a very high fever, and the doctor at the detention center would keep giving him cough drops instead of any other medicine. So I think this incident, including both denial of medicine, but also the disempowerment of this adult woman at the hands of a foreign imperialist state, made me start thinking about the experiences immigrant parents have in the United States. So when I was beginning to start thinking about this project, I was literally initially caught up in thinking about the law, how you can look for love, care, dignity within the law. And I found that it wasn't very well codified, and I couldn't really use it to advocate for immigrant parents. At this point, I had started working in the nonprofit world and had started seeing how certain movements sought to build power and networks for social change at the grassroots level. In particular, I was interested in the reproductive justice movement. And so with that preface, I'm going to talk a bit about what the RJ movement stands for and how its vision is something that I thought had affinities with the immigration justice movement and how it brought value to this immigration justice movement. So as you may know, the reproductive justice was a term coined by Black women activists in 1994. This movement was born out of certain disillusionment with the mainstream women's rights movement. And they had a few gripes with this movement, but I'm going to name a few. First, the mainstream women's rights movement was led by and represented the needs of middle-class and rich white women. Second, it was premised on a negative freedom from state control when it came to interference with decisions of abortion and family planning. So women of color advocates began seeing issues with the visions and the limited visions of this movement. First, they argued that the right to choose, the framework of the right to choice, has developed alienated people from its social context in which they make those decisions. So Dr. Angela Davis identifies why does the fight to legalize abortion stop there instead of asking why Black and Latina women are choosing abortion? She says, I quote, "The stories they tell are not so much about their desire to be free of their pregnancy, but rather about the miserable social conditions which dissuade them from bringing new lives into the world." Second, Roe v. Wade was decided on a bedrock of privacy. It was also a negative right of non-interference that was proven in Harris v. McRae when the Supreme Court said that no state action was required to help women have abortions when they could not afford it. So this framework left out women and people who needed government support or active interference, which would be a positive right in order to get the resources to access these abortions and family planning services. Finally, the mainstream reproductive rights movement was hyper-focused on abortion and family planning and sidelined questions like, what happens to those who want to be parents and can't be because the government doesn't allow them to be? And what happens after they become parents? In what conditions are they forced to bring up their children? And so these conversations led to women of color collectives and RJ advocates understanding the importance of considering various factors of race, gender, class, equality, immigration status, and how they bear upon reproductive decisions. And they put forward three rights: the right not to parent, which is championed by the women's rights movement, the right to parent, and the right to raise one's children in safe and healthy environments. And they decided to consider everything. They decided to consider education, food, policing, transportation, immigration law, all of these factors as they bear upon reproductive decisions. So in my paper, I decided to focus on the right to raise one's children in safe and healthy environments, and kind of soon realized that there's an overlap in the kinds of families that are allowed to become parents and the kind of families and parents who are given the conditions to raise their children in safe and healthy environments. And so here the concept of stratified reproduction, which is put forth by an anthropologist, Shelley Colin, became insightful for me because she talks about how reproductive labor is differently valued and rewarded and is informed by existing inequalities based on race, class, immigration status, etc. And so following this, law professor Anna Pell writes about how a good parent, she talks about who a good parent is, and she says, it's an all or nothing mold in which mothers are middle class, English speaking, married, child protectors who do not engage in activities such as illegal drug use, prostitution, or property crimes. They do not have too many children, are not grandmothers, and do not live in extended kin networks. So against this background, I started thinking about what exactly contributed to making immigrant parents so far away from this ideal parent goalpost, such that there are such brazen attacks on their parenthood all the time. And so a deeper dive into this encouraged me to look into public and popular discourse around immigrant parenting. And I talk about three such narratives in my paper. The first is the depiction of immigrants as illegal. And as you know, entering or re-entering the US makes you not just illegal, but is a federal crime, so you're also a criminal. And criminals are not usually seen as nice people or great parents. And when we trace back, there's a long history of painting immigrants as criminals. So in the aftermath of 9/11, we saw the rounding up and deportation of Arab and Asian men. And also since the hijackers overstayed their visa, there were calls to protect our borders, which led to the birth of ICE, which is now, it's terrorizing immigrant families. And so this led to headlines from channels like NBC Now, which say non-citizens account for 64% of all federal arrests, Justice Department says. And when they say this, it's used to stoke frenzy and fear, but the truth is that they're simply being arrested for breathing on US soil. And of course, this dog whistling did not get better in Trump's administration, where he says about immigrants, they're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they are rapists. A second myth that I discuss is that of hyperfertility and sexuality. And there are several examples of this because it became rampant after the Latino population considerably increased between 1990 and 2000. And following this, many nativists describe Latinos as a population with their pants down or said that they breed like rabbits. and they discuss the outnumbering of white people by brown people who are definitely less legitimate Americans. And so this is the kind of attitude that was also seen supporting forced sterilization of immigrant women. And similarly, with this issue of breeding, there's a similar issue of sexualization. And it's obvious in the case of Asian women who've historically been depicted as dragon ladies or prostitutes. Finally, I discussed the narrative of birth tourism and anchor babies. So anchor babies are children poor women are said to have when they come into the United States from the southern border. And these women are made out to have these children only to avail of US citizenship or welfare benefits. And while Trump has talked about anchor babies a lot, he doesn't just stop there. He says he combines this with this idea of chain migration, in that one person comes in, has an anchor baby, and suddenly there are 24 other people coming in. And these ideas are always linked to ideas of economic and environmental scarcity. So these people are coming in to take away jobs from Americans, to use resources, and to use welfare benefits, which is very similar to the welfare queen trope that was weaponized to control Black women from reproducing. So what is the point of all of this? What are these narratives really used for? And I argue that they form some basis in policymaking and impact individual assessments of parental fitness or rights under the law. And I talk about how this entire landscape of narrative and policy, it makes it impossible for immigrant parents to raise their children in safe and healthy environments. In fact, it is the intended effect. Or as Mitt Romney would say, it is used to cause immigrants to self-deport when you make life so difficult for them that they have no option but to leave. And so I give four examples of how immigrants are rendered completely powerless in parenting their children. I'm going to be discussing two right now. First, I discussed the role of producing illegality, and living life as a criminal in the shadows means that you have to think 3 times before driving down a certain road to pick your child up from soccer practice, lest you get apprehended, arrested, and deported. It means that if your children are aware of your status, they will be scared to see policemen, sheriffs, politicians. I've cited data showing child-reported anxiety and depression when they have undocumented parents. And if, let's say, one parent is deported, they may be forced to be raised on minimum wage by single parents. Finally, I discuss the conditions of family separation, of being kept in inhumane conditions at the border, and even talking about the incidents of sexual violence against children in these facilities. I also discussed the role of the child welfare system. So immigrant children often reach the foster care system because their immigrant parents have been detained or deported. And under the 14th Amendment jurisprudence, a showing of parental unfitness is required when you're terminating their rights. But for immigrant parents, courts have been seen to skip over this step and only consider whether it's in the best interest of the child, an analysis which is often informed by the same norms that help us understand who a good parent is. First, children are taken away for neglect, and the effects of neglect are very similar to the effects of poverty. And I will discuss that immigrants are precluded from holding formal jobs because of their status. So it is a vicious cycle. Furthermore, I cite the work of Anita Madali, who's a legal scholar, who talks about how courts have terminated parental rights because the parents were present in the country illegally, making them criminals, and being at risk of deportation was enough to deem this parent unfit. And by this logic, I argue that no undocumented parent can then be fit to parent their child. I also discussed the best interest of a child analysis when the parent is being deported and the child is a US citizen. Courts have found that it's in the best interest of the child to be separated from their parents because something like the US educational system might be better than their home countries. These are the same countries that Trump has called shithole countries. Anyway, so in my paper, I discussed 2 other ways in which parents are unable to parent their children with dignity. I talk about immigration law, how immigration law reacting to the same welfare queen narratives forbid undocumented parents and their children from accessing publicly funded healthcare or buying coverage on ACA marketplaces, which lead to poorer health outcomes and diminished well-being. I also discussed opportunities for economic mobility available to immigrant parents and discussed the Immigration Reform and Control Act, which prohibits employers from knowingly hiring undocumented workers, leading to a host of issues, such as making them being unable to sue for back pay and wage theft. I could go on about the ways in which immigration law and policy are designed to make it very hard for immigrant parents to raise their children with love, care, safety, dignity. But I want to spend a few minutes talking about how we can collectively dream and imagine realities that don't reproduce the violence of the immigration system. So it's important here to mention that the RJ movement, unlike the mainstream women's rights movement, is not fixated on using the law and litigation as primary tools for social change, given that the arena is not accessible to movement actors, as can be best seen in the case while advocating for undocumented immigrants. I discussed 3 sets of changes in my paper, and I'll briefly go over them. The first one encapsulates changes to law and policy, including repealing laws that criminalize migration, enacting labor and civil rights protections for migrants, and making healthcare accessible to all. My second set of recommendations include embracing a human rights framework as proposed by RJ advocates, and ratifying and enforcing human rights instruments such as the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which the US has not ratified. Finally, this paper draws upon the radical visions proposed by scholars who are now thinking about decarceration, abolition, ending deportation, and a no borders politics. In concluding my paper and presentation, I express gratitude to the reproductive justice movement and the Women of Care collectives that have made it what it is. I'm grateful for its capacious vision, one that allows us to look at reproduction as larger than just giving birth, one that makes us question discourse and how it's connected to policy, one that implores us to think intersectionally, and that gives us such a robust framework to analyze power. Thank you all for listening and for holding this space for my thoughts.
Now we will hear from Professor Keys.
Thank you. Can we have a round of applause for our wonderful... I'm so delighted to be here. I am a proud member of the UB faculty, and this is my first time presenting at this conference, and I'm very excited. So thank you for the invitation. I have been researching confronting the issue of climate migration, which is massive in itself. And today I'm going to try to focus that large topic on coming at it through one dimension, which is gender. So there's several aspects to how we think about where migration fits into the problems of climate change, and specifically then how gender intersects with those. I'll only be talking about 2 of these today, but I wanted to give you my sort of framework for this. The first aspect of this question, which is large, is thinking about who is vulnerable to climate change in the first place, what strategies might be deployed to build resilience to climate change. When resilience isn't possible, what role migration plays as an adaptation strategy? And then finally, what measures can we put in place to permit flourishing in the new setting post-migration? And as you've heard just now, many of those conditions are not in place currently. And gender is a cross-cutting theme for all of these. And I should say that, of course, gender is important to this, but in deeply intersectional ways. And if you'll permit a quick quote, it's from scholars at the Division of Risk Management and Social Safety in Sweden. This has supported the intersectional lens to understand the interaction between caste, class, gender, ethnicity, age, race, and other social differences in a context where power emerges to shape unequal vulnerabilities associated with migration. So I will be talking about gender, but you'll see as I go that these issues are deeply inherently intersectional. So to put us all on the same page to start, I wanted to just give a sense of what I am talking about when I look at climate change as a cause of flight or migration. Typically, the climate crisis itself is not a direct cause. And indeed, even when people are migrating because of climate, it may not be the first thing they say about the reason for their migration. But we have here, from top to bottom, approximately, a range of effects that go from slow onset that we see coming at us to rapid onset. And of course, when something is perceivable in advance, it gives us more opportunity to plan for change, which is where planning for migration would come in. When something is rapid onset, like a hurricane or fire, that planning moment is close to non-existent. So we see sea level rise and flooding displacing people already, reduced availability of water, decrease in crop yields, resulting often in conflicts over resources, and then climate-related disasters that have always happened, but whose frequency or intensity are being worsened by climate change. All of these, I'm an immigration person, I tend to look beyond our borders. All of these, of course, affect communities within the United States. And we'll see that's a place where I actually find a little hope for building solidarity. So when we look at the vulnerability to those flight factors and gender, we can think about things like the loss of land with sea level rise and flooding, equating with loss of community. And women in many, many places are the stewards of community, of tradition, and loss of community carries a sharp and heavy weight for women. Reduced availability of water in many countries, gathering water for cooking, cleaning, the use in the home is women's work. And as water has become scarcer, that burden increases upon women. The decrease in crop yields is significant when women lack access to investment in agriculture, unequal access to innovations. There is a lot happening in the world of climate change mitigation and innovation and resources for that, but those innovations are not typically, there are exceptions, putting gender at the forefront, which again can lead to conflicts over resources. And here, this is where my clinical practice intersects with this issue. We see many female-headed households where the woman is remaining behind after men have migrated, and perhaps that family has dissolved in the meantime, or the male partner is just long out of the picture. They're incredibly vulnerable to those increased conflicts. And we see that throughout Central America. Do those folks present themselves to my clinic saying, I'm a climate migrant? No. But when we dig beneath the surface, that is absolutely there. And then in terms of those sort of sudden onset fires and hurricanes, and to some extent drought, that can happen on a short time frame, women with differential physical capacity, like poor health indicators, may be less likely to survive migration. And having financial resources is key to being able to leave quickly and safely in the event of a climate-related disaster. So every place we see gender disparity in any issue that we might care about, we can tie it into some of these vulnerabilities to climate change themselves. In the interest of time and not depressing you too much, I will skip over this slide to say it's getting worse. And so I want to, that slide has some scary statistics. And you may have noticed in the quick thing, it only goes over about the next 100 years before things get really ugly. So migration will need to be a strategy. It won't be a strategy equally available to all, but to the extent it could be a strategy, right now we really have none. And I wanted to talk about just a couple of ways to frame this issue. First, to recognize that most of what I'm talking about happens within borders. People move within their own countries for a host of reasons. It also is overwhelmingly happening in the global South. Despite what might seem from the rhetoric around immigration in the United States, when it comes to receiving the world's migrants, we are but a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of those numbers. And that, I believe, will hold true in the future, no matter what the governor of Texas is saying these days. You can ask me about that in the Q&A. Migration also requires resources. So thinking about health, money, family, and or community support. And migration requires a path. And that's where I have really been focusing my scholarly interest on the gaps in our path for would-be migrants. Internationally, people look to the Refugee Convention, as we'll see very shortly. That is not a great option. There's also potential under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, to which we are not a party, but other countries are. And so perhaps that can be of use elsewhere in the world. This I will not go through in detail, but this is the definition of a refugee under international law, the Refugee Convention, imported into US law through the Refugee Act of 1980. And where the left-hand side of the screen essentially addresses the fact that people may be outside their country. That part's easy for climate migrants. The green box is where we start getting into trouble. Is the reason they can't go home persecution? We might clear that hurdle because persecution has been understood as severe harms to life. So that might be okay, but it must be persecution on account of one of 5 protected reasons. And you'll notice gender is not one of those reasons. Race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. Creative advocates, especially in the Fourth Circuit, are really making some strong advances to permit gender to be its own basis under the convention. It's become easier to argue, but that's not universal. One must argue it. And what's really important and implicit in this is there has to be a perpetrator. Somebody has to be doing the persecution. And in climate change, there is a perpetrator, generally the global north, the industrialized history of the last 2 centuries, but that is not the kind of perpetrator the convention means. It's a faceless one. People still can be protected. Berta Cáceres was assassinated in Honduras for speaking out bravely for indigenous rights, for environmental rights. She was a tremendous activist. People who face the kinds of risks that she did, would absolutely fit under the convention on account of their political opinions. Straightforward. Maria Timon is a climate activist from the island of Kiribati in the Pacific Island nations. And I create a hypothetical that's not true, but just to say maybe within the set of islands of Kiribati, perhaps there's an island that the government is seeking to quash for some political reasons. They might be able to fashion a claim to protection based on maybe their ethnicity, which falls under nationality, it's or race. The convention is weird. They might be able to fashion a claim, but there would have to be a direct political action targeting a group that has cognizable protection under the convention. A farmer in Honduras, this is one of my clinic cases, not a client. This is stolen without attribution from the internet, this photo. A farmer in Honduras has one of the last patches of arable land available. The mayor of her town involves a local criminal cartel to start pressuring her to abandon the land so the mayor can take it over. The pressure involves death threats and drive-by shootings. She flees. She will fit under the protection of the convention. A farmer in Mali who is facing desertification of her land and moves to neighboring Senegal, does not. Climate underlies all of these. The convention treats them quite differently. And I've highlighted the most plausible cases. Most people will not qualify. We have the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is potentially going to be a source of this obligation called non-refoulement, which is generally a Refugee Convention word, but it means non-return. We will not return you to a place where you would be you would have no right to life because of climate change. This fly is really angry about climate change. And just 2 years ago, a case came before them, and the Human Rights Committee said it's not quite right for this, but we see a time in the future where people will be able to bring claims for protection, the right to remain in a country because of the effects of climate change. So that holds some possibilities. My dream is that we think about this differently. The Refugee Convention thinks in terms of victims, and is often there's sort of a savior piece to it, which makes a lot of us in asylum law a bit uncomfortable, when really we should be talking about duties to people who are bearing the harms done by others, and specifically here, the global North. We do not have this framework where there's a duty, a recognized duty, the breach of which, would lead to liability and remedies. However, I have been excavating very small programs in US history where there is an implicit recognition of duty. And I will credit Professor Margaret Johnson for pointing me toward the program that we have for residents of the Marshall Islands and the Federated States of Micronesia. So this is a small population, I admit that. But we, the United States, conducted nuclear testing in those islands and destroyed their ability to live healthy, flourishing lives. And in recognition of that debt, that duty breached, there's a really easy path to immigration. It's not perfect, but it's really easy. And there are other small examples like that. And of course, rhetorically, we heard this as well with the evacuation of our Afghan allies last August, whose situation has disappeared from the news, but their cases are not being well tended to. And that all of this is overlaid on a deeply broken immigration system, separate talk. But there was real articulation of this idea of duty. We had a duty to help bring people in, and we did bring people in. And so I'm looking at that. I also think, as I alluded to at the very beginning, there is a potential for building solidarity between US communities affected by climate change, whether it's the terrible wildfires out west, flooding in rich neighborhoods of Charleston, and people facing flooding in their homes, fires, hurricanes. If we see ourselves as in this same crisis together, there's at least a potential of working together on this issue. And as well, I like to look at ways in history that we have accommodated large-scale migrations of people within the United States, the Dust Bowl, Hurricane Maria, Hurricane Katrina, without the world ending. And I believe, this is going to be a fight and an issue that extends well beyond the law. The law feels like it plays this much of a piece in a much larger problem. But I hope by focusing attention on the ways that the law right now is not set up to address this question, we all start working creatively to address that problem. So thank you for your attention.
Thanks so much, Professor Peace. And last, but certainly not least, we will be hearing from Professor Karen.
Awesome.
Fabulous Josh is going to come down and switch me birthday.
Sweet. Well, while the fabulous Josh comes and switches it over, I can go ahead and get started.
Although I kind of like the idea of like the impossible dream, right? So I wish, perfect, yeah. Great. So it's real lovely to follow Professor Keyes, and I'm really sorry that but I have learned from UB colleagues to stop apologizing and instead to say thank you so much to the Center of Applied Feminism and UB and my very dear menstrual justice mentor and friend, Dean Johnson, and her talented co-director, Michelle Gildman, who has really deepened my thinking on the role of femtech in this space in particular. So I heard you already learned who I am, so I will just say that I direct a legislation and civil rights clinic at UDC, where I teach students how to be effective legislative lawyers at the intersection of text, law, policy, and politics. And the reason that's important to my intro now is because since I lateraled to UDC in 2016, got it. I was one of those people this morning, I should know better. So since 2016, when I lateraled to UDC, I've been saying the words period and menstruation into mics. So that was a good prompt. And really starting to talk about, to anyone who will give me a mic, the role that law can play in addressing menstruation and periods in all the spaces for all the people that menstruate currently or formerly. And I know others in the room, like the center's co-directors, have joined me on that quest. But for those of you that have not yet joined the menstrual movement, welcome. And I say that because this conference and this bug has joined the movement. It's going from climate change to periods, because this conference is about big ideas and this panel is about human rights. So here's my big idea. Menstruation matters to you, right? It matters to you, and we need to acknowledge and address this experience, including by addressing periods at work. Because even if you are not a menstruator currently or formerly, right, periods impact your workplace. And so if we actually think about the role that law and public policy can play in addressing periods at work, we're going to help individuals, we're going to help businesses, and we're going to help the community at large. And while periods have historically been viewed as invisible individual problems, as Professor Johnson, myself, and others have worked to show, there is actually a need for a systemic response. So for the rest of my time, I'm going to explain why this actually should not be a big idea, even though I'm posing it as one, because it's a universal truth, right, that most people don't stop and think about it. But the moment I or someone else points it out to you, it becomes apparent. Right? Periods don't stop in most of the spaces that you are in. And most people spend a fair amount of time at work. So some of you here right now might be menstruating. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand. And while you might not be the law professor who menstruates into the, not into the microphone, but talks about it into the microphone, or a law student who menstruates, you might recall a time, even if that's not right now, where you hid a product in your sleeve, or where you tapped a neighbor on the shoulder to say they might be leaking and need a product, or couldn't figure out how to fit a bathroom break into back-to-back Zoom meetings, or how you couldn't run to a store if you leaked through your clothing so as not to be embarrassed because you knew there'd be a repercussion for you. And if you're in this room or in Zoom, where I was earlier, you likely have some level of privilege. Right? You likely have more control and predictability over your workplace than many others. So now imagine if you're working for a company that requires workers to provide information about their cycles to be tracked, or told that female but not male factory workers have to wear a red bracelet or a sign that says toilet on them in a bid to humiliate them into taking less bathroom breaks. That was the reason a stupid employer put in an internal memo that was leaked. Or told to stop being lazy, right? Or to man up. Those are all things that people have heard about periods at work. Others have been fired for damaging company property when they bled through their clothes and stained property. They weren't fired for their periods. They were fired for damaging company property, even though they had been denied bathroom breaks. And so while Professor Goodmark was able to get red chairs in this auditorium as her successful a contribution among many others to UB, right? Most workplaces don't have red chairs. And when you stand up and there's a stain, it can be embarrassing or lead to other repercussions. And so while I could keep sharing, instead I'm gonna put a roadmap up to hold me accountable, as I think I'm the last speaker of the day other than Professor Gilman. And so if you don't mind telling me when I have to. Ooh, lovely, sweet. See what happens when you get stuck on a train and you hear mechanical issues and you freak out. I've already started talking about why menstruation matters at work and the role that law has to play in addressing it. But I'm going to talk a little bit more and dig deeper into menstruation at work in America, then introduce you to some things around the world, and then talk about moving forward. And the basis of my remarks are found in the article that's cited on the slide. The final finishing touches in theory are getting done right now. So, but will be posted shortly. So with that roadmap, the big idea. That shouldn't be a big idea, but still is. Right. But actually, before we get into that big idea, I know that there was some talk, or I think there was some talk about menstruation and menopause yesterday for those of you that were here. But in case you weren't, and because we have awful menstrual education in America and actually around the world, a moment on biology and terminology so we're all on the same page. So some biology. About once a month, some people experience the biological process of menstruation, which consists of shedding the uterine lining. This process is called a period, demonstrating some of the reason people don't talk about that periods or feel shame or are harassed by it. It's also called Aunt Flo, time of month, code red, Shark Week, monthly friend, visitor, and according to a 2016 study, over 5,000 other slang words, including a gift. And for those of you that are not menstruators, let me just tell you, I have never viewed it as a gift, and I'd guess that most people that have experienced it share that sentiment. But regardless of what you call it, right, periods are experienced by menstruators, right? People with a uterus and at least one ovary who've reached puberty and are not yet in menopause. And I and some others use this word intentionally because while most menstruators are cis girls and women, not all women menstruate, and not all menstruators are women. Transgender men, genderqueer, nonconforming, intersex individuals, and others also may menstruate or be in perimenopause or menopause. So menopause is the permanent cessation of menstruation. It's measured at the point of 12 months after a person's last period. And the time frame between when people are menstruating and in menopause is called perimenopause. It lasts for about 7 years, and it's while your cycle and body are transitioning. It's often characterized by erratic and unpredictable heavy bleeding, regardless of people's ages. Hysterectomies and other procedures also can cause menopause. In my work, I use the umbrella term menstruation to cover all stages in the menstrual cycle. And I use the word menstruators to capture people who are currently or formerly having experienced menstruation. Menstruation itself is not a disability, but menstruation-related conditions such as endometriosis, which impacts 1 out of 10 people who menstruate, is a disability or can be. Some menstrual-related conditions also disproportionately impact certain groups of menstruators. So for example, Black menstruators are more prone to uterine fibroids or undergo hysterectomies and myomectomies at substantially greater rates than others. And with that sort of shared vocabulary, what's the problem? Right, so I've already joked about it a number of times in the couple of minutes since I got off the train. But for cultural, right, religious, and other reasons, people are taught not to talk about periods. And this complicates the reality that periods don't stop when people are at work. Menstruation doesn't stop at work, it happens. And on average, menstruators have more than 480 cycles over the course of their life. And what each person needs during each of those cycles might be different. It could be different for a variety of reasons, from stress to diet to hereditary characteristics. Many people don't have any problem addressing this process at work. They have access to structures that allow regular, safe, and adequate application and disposal of menstrual products, and the education and income needed to afford them. They exist in places and spaces and with people who won't stigmatize them or harass them or prevent opportunities because of menstruation. They provide and afford others bodily dignity, and privacy is respected when people need to address their periods. But there's a growing recognition that that's not everyone's reality. And the structural mismatch, right, prevents other people from managing periods at work. So with that, right, I'll share that there has been a movement, right, to change this dynamic. Right, some of that movement comes from employer-provided period policies. Those policies have come from collective action. One of my favorite stories is from a Boston SEIU local from the 70s, where the workers walked out and asked to speak with management. And in preparing for the negotiations to end the walkout, the workers elected to strategically bargain for tampon machines that had been removed for cost-cutting measures because they knew it would make the people they were negotiating against uncomfortable and that they would get it, and it would start the process, right, of having some dialogue and some wins for workers, and it increased their membership. Right. CBA provisions also have a number of menstrual-friendly protections. Workers have filed grievances under them if they haven't been able to use them. And with the increase of menstruators in union leadership, including Liz Schuler as president of the AFL, I hope that unions take more of a role in menstruation. There's also voluntary employer practices like those on the slide. But even with best practice employers and even with bargaining, right, only a small number of menstruators are covered at work. Which brings me to what's law got to do with it. So for the next 6 hours, I'm going to explain every bullet point that's up on that slide. But I'm not going to do that because this is the big idea part of it, right? In my paper, I do actually talk about the 3 buckets of menstrual needs that are on the slide: accommodations, including break time and access to privacy and restrooms and safe ways to address menstruation. I also talk about rules and needs related to touching blood and disposing blood. And then I talk about, how to be free from menstrual indignities and discrimination at work. And I go through each of the bullet points, right, both on the national, local, and on the international level about how there are existing laws that address some needs, right? But you have to know about them. You have to be covered by them. You have to be able to afford to talk about it. And you have to be willing to break that silence that exists in our culture to try to enforce your rights. And that's if you're even covered by one of these conflicting or sort of interwoven laws. So if I get overwhelmed when I look at this slide and I put it together, and I also teach employment law and have been an employment lawyer for quite some time now, right? This makes me uncomfortable. So imagine the average worker, right? And trying to figure out, do I have a right to take a break? Can I go home if I bled through my pants? Who has to pay for the uniform that's beige more often than not that is now stained or clean? Who has to clean it, right? Can I actually dispose of these things? Is there water, right? What happens when someone tells me I'm on the rag or need to man up, right? Is there someone I can talk to? And so the short answer is there are some protections that will cover some of those, but you need to understand what laws got to do with it. And you don't have 6 hours for me to go through each of the bullet points. So in the paper, I talk about a proposal, right, to intentionally and strategically use law and public policy to support menstruation at work, right, so that you don't have to pigeonhole a menstruation-related need into an existing protection that was created for something else. And I believe we can do that, right? We can do that by providing access to reasonable accommodations, by providing anti-discrimination protection, and by providing anti-retaliation. And to do that, there's really only a couple of changes that need to be implemented. Those changes are going to take some effort, but first we can require federal labor standards to provide current or former menstruators the ability to alter work schedules. Right? We can revise regulations to require menstrual products, other things. We can expand anti-discrimination protections, right? And the government can enact a coordinated two-track, right, public education campaign to research and study these needs, right? And also understand the enforcement that's happening and take care of the sort of policy interventions that are popping up, right? Including around the world. Right. And so we can study these to see, right? What's working and what's not working. We can look at some of the UN standards that have been created, not specifically about menstruation, but are more, they actually say the word sometimes, right? That talk about sanitation and the right to economic security, the standards and goals that deal with promoting gender equity and reducing poverty, the ILO, International Labor Organization, safety standards, specific country laws that deal with the right to menstrual products provided by the government, or menstrual leave, which has been around in some capacity since after World War I in Russia and Japan, and for which we're seeing renewed conversation. And we can look at the laws that have clearer application of their anti-discrimination protections, right? With case law that explicitly says that menopause, perimenopause, and menstruation are covered under equality acts around the world. And so stay tuned for more. And although this is a big idea, I really wish it wasn't, right? Because many people in this room I know have experienced some version of what was talked about. And so welcome to the movement. And thank you, Lee, for getting red chairs. You got a lot of other workplaces to get on.
Thank you all so much for the work that you do and for sharing. It was certainly really interesting and valuable. And I'm sure that we have questions and we have time for a couple of them. So I see a couple of hands in the audience.
Hi. Whoa, that is real loud. All right. Hi, my name is Alona Del Rosario. I'm a second-year student here at UB. And Professor Karen, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about kind of where your, and I believe Professor Johnson's work is around menstruation and the bar exam right now, as I think there's a number of us in here who will be taking the bar in the next couple of years.
Sure, absolutely. And it's also lovely to see you. Alona and I did some domestic violence advocacy together in Arizona probably a decade ago or so, last year. And so it's just really nice to see you again. And it's also just nice to see this is my first in-person event since the pandemic. And so it's really lovely. There's no group I would do it for other than this one. And so the short answer is we're on it. Right. And Alona and every other law student in here is welcome to join us. Right. I mentioned you're all going to be in the menstrual movement. Well, now's your chance. That can be your gateway issue. Right. Professor Johnson, myself, and Professor Liz Cooper at Fordham created a group called Menstrual Policies in the Bar to help advocate for all of you. Right. And to start removing or paying attention to the need to remove barriers related to menstruation to the entry of the legal profession. And so we came up with a model policy. We studied past examinees. We studied the sort of boards of law examiners in 56 jurisdictions to see what they were doing. And students created a model policy with our guidance. We sent it to every board of law examiner at the end of last year. We've seen some incremental changes. I'm very thrilled and excited about that, but there's a lot more to do. And so for anyone that is interested in that, please come talk to any of us because we'd love to have you on board.
Thank you so much.
Hi, Marcy. My question is also for you. And I first just thank you for being here. It is such a nice way to bring us full circle back to last night. And so again, great curating of panels, everybody. I love it. So I'm thinking, I have so many thoughts buzzing around in my brain. And I'm thinking back to our last panel around the Me Too movement and just this general idea about women not being believed and false claims and all these things. And as I looked up at your slide, I found myself wondering, how much of a barrier do you see that issue, right? We're like, these lazy women are just like making up stuff about their periods because they don't want to work, and potentially some of the employment backlash against some of these, in my opinion, very reasonable accommodations and policies that you're thinking about enacting.
Yeah, thank you for the question. The most common retort that I see in response to claims is it's just not a big deal. right? So it's no big deal, right? Just take care of your period during a break. Just go buy yourself products, right? Just go do this, as if every menstruator is me and has the ability to control, right, what's going on. And that's just not the reality of a number of people's experiences. And so for me, that anti-retaliation protection is really important, because it just adds another layer of people at least a little bit of protection, because people are afraid to talk about it. They are afraid that they will, one, they're uncomfortable talking about it because no one else in their life talks about periods, at least not publicly. Two, there aren't a lot of menstruators in position of power in workplaces still, right? We have a long way to go to change the dynamic of who controls sites, right? And who controls work. And that means that we do have a long way to go to people addressing and understanding, right, why breaks are needed, why leave might be needed, why people could need multiple time away, not just on the first of the month, right, but to address medical conditions and other things. And so it's definitely connected. And for me, menstruation is part of a larger reproductive justice agenda, right? So it's absolutely related to the way people, not just reproductive justice, feminist agenda, right? It's why I love being here today, because it's related to our people allowed to talk about the things that matter to them in controlling their body. And if not, that's a problem.
All right, we have time for one or two more questions. So go ahead, and then we'll end
Wonderful.
with
So
Margaret.
I want to just join the conversation with a question for Professor Keys, and thank you all for this rich discussion. My question is, in thinking about internal migration within the US, how does that connect to the sort of overall project? And I'll give credit to a student I have who's working on a paper about disaster law in the US and how it connects to, and often does not include sufficient benefits for undocumented people, and envisioning what immigration possibilities could look like in that space and some of the challenges there.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to that question. And so the things that are coming into my mind first are that the internal migrations, first, they're interesting to study because they help us see all the issues and reveal all the issues without the extra problem of the border, which the border piece is solvable. The extra pieces are actually, the origin pieces are actually a lot more difficult. And to that, I give enormous credit and praise to the environmental justice movement, where this intersectional analysis and organizing has been, at the forefront for 40 to 50 years. A little bit less so on the immigration side. So I need to think about, I haven't yet stretched this to what this would mean to undocumented folks affected within the United States by climate change, but we know they're heavily featured in the vulnerability to climate change. Where are they living in the cheapest, most difficult places? Which places are affected by climate change? Vulnerable neighborhoods geographically. And we've seen emergency provisions that do protect immigrants for a matter of weeks after disasters. I don't know. I'm not familiar with the study of how effective they were in promoting a sense of safety and possibility to the undocumented immigrants who were affected by those disasters. But I think there are things to build upon, and I realize I'm being vague, but you've gotten me interested in something that's deserving of further thought. So thank you for the question.
Thank you. Okay, our final question.
Well, it's actually not a question. It's a comment, and this is for you, Assis. I just want to say how much I love your paper. As someone who thinks about and writes in the reproductive justice space, this idea of overlapping immigration justice or having it intersect with reproductive justice is so important. So I love this, the third concept of reproductive justice, of being able to raise your child in a safe and healthy environment. And of course, we can think about the separation at the border, but the way that you brought in the how many roads do you have to go down to get to your kid's soccer practice just really brought it home in a way that I hadn't thought about it before. So that's it. I just wanted to say thank you for your work. I look forward to reading your paper.
Oh, thank you so much.
And thank you so much to our wonderful panel.
All right, just a very quick thank you and goodbye. We've thanked our staff and administration, but I want to thank all our panelists for sharing their big ideas with us, and all our audience members here live and on Zoom for joining us for this conversation. This is the 13th annual Legal Feminist Theory Conference. In prior years, we had narrower topics: applied feminism and health, applied feminism and democracy, applied feminism and family law. You get the idea. And we did a really deep, sophisticated dive into those issues. But this year, Margaret and I were like, we want to pull back a little. We want to know what's happening on the cutting edge of feminist legal theory. Want to put our finger on the pulse of what people are thinking about that really pushes us to expand our notions of what theory can really do. And panelists, you have exceeded our expectations in every way. I think this conference is just a great example of the best of academia. When we're talking about theory, not just for theory's sake, but because it impacts people's lives on the ground. And I feel very fortunate to be part of a community committed to those ideas. I think it's not surprising that so many of our panelists are clinical professors, right? Still practicing law. And even those who are not clinical professors, I've learned express their ideas in the media, are activists, are advisors to different groups within the legal system and advocacy groups that are advocating. Everyone is working hard to translate these really sophisticated ideas in ways that lay people and policymakers and the media can understand to fully really have an impact. So I have a lot to think about. I'm sure you all do. It's like a lot of information to process today. We also need to think about what are our next steps. How do we continue to have these dialogues and these communications and share the connections that were made today? How do we build movements out of these ideas? And so, this is step one, sharing these ideas, and let's all work together on, bringing them to fruition, bringing them to reality. So I wish you all a fantastic weekend. These are the stalwarts left here in the room after a long day. And thank you everyone for being part of this. You really make it quite special.
I sometimes get a lot of these issues. It's like, where do I start?